Tell me to leave. Matthew Chandler's voice came out low and rough, like gravel dragged across hardwood, and Theodora Atwood felt the words land somewhere deep in her chest where she had no business letting them reach. She stood in the doorway of her farmhouse with the last amber light of October bleeding across the Kansas plains behind her, and she looked at this man, this drifter who had arrived in early July with nothing but a bedroll, a worn saddle, and eyes that held secrets she had not yet been able to name, and she felt the full, terrible weight of what she was about to say. "You should go," she said. Her voice did not shake. She was proud of that. "The harvest is finished. There is nothing here to hold you." Matthew did not move from where he stood beside the fence post he had just finished mending. He had spent 3 hours on that fence post. He had not been asked to. He had simply seen it leaning and fixed it because that was the kind of man he was, and that was precisely the problem. "Tell me to leave," he said again, and this time there was something different in it, a challenge wrapped in tenderness, a dare wrapped in devotion. "Say the words plain, Theodora. Tell me to go and watch me stay anyway." The silence that followed was the loudest thing she had ever heard. She had known this moment was coming. She had been dreading it and craving it in equal measure since the morning 6 weeks ago when she had first seen his face, dust-covered and sun-worn, at the gate of her property on the edge of Harlan County. Since before that, maybe. Since the moment she had understood that the man who had come to help her bring in her wheat was not simply passing through. Since the moment she had understood that Matthew Chandler had his own hidden reasons for staying, and that those reasons were more dangerous to her heart than anything the drought or the creditors or the long, brutal Kansas summer had ever managed to threaten. She pressed her fingers against the doorframe and tried to find the words that would save her. She could not find them, and in that failure, that soft and devastating silence, the whole story of how they had arrived at this impossible moment came flooding back through her. It had been the 4th of July, 1883, when Matthew Chandler first appeared on the road outside Theodora Atwood's farm. Theodora had been standing at the edge of her east field, surveying the wheat with the calm, practiced eye of a woman who had been farming this land alone for 2 years and had learned to read trouble before it fully announced itself. The wheat was good this year, better than last, when the June rains had failed and she had lost nearly a third of her crop. This year the stalks stood tall and golden green, not yet ripe, but promising everything they had withheld the year before. She needed this harvest. She needed it badly. The Harlan County Bank held a note on her land, $140, due by November 1st. Her husband, Preston Atwood, had taken that loan out 18 months before his death, using the farm as collateral against a plan to expand the wheat acreage on the North Quarter. Preston had been a careful man in most respects but had possessed an optimistic streak that had occasionally outpaced his careful reasoning, and the expansion plan had been one of those occasions. He had died of a fever in the spring of 1881, leaving Theodora with the land, the note, and a grief so clean and total that she had not known what to do with herself for 6 months. She had eventually done what she always did. She had worked. 2 hired men from town had helped her through the harvest of 1881, and she had managed to pay the interest on the loan and keep enough to see the farm through winter. In 1882, the drought had cost her, and she had paid the interest again but nothing toward the principal. And Mr. Harlow at the bank had begun looking at her in that particular way bankers developed when they sensed vulnerability, with a smile that was almost kind and eyes that were calculating the distance between sympathy and seizure. This was the year that mattered. This harvest, this fall, this window between the long summer heat and the first killing frost. She needed every hand she could afford, and she could not afford many. She had just finished counting her available funds in her head, a habit that had grown painful and precise over 2 years of solitary accounting, when she saw the figure on the road. He was on foot, which was unusual. Most men who traveled the road between Harlan and the next county west did so on horseback or in a wagon. This man walked with a steady, unhurried pace that somehow did not suggest poverty or desperation, but rather a kind of chosen deliberateness, as though he had decided that walking was the correct speed for whatever he was doing. He led a horse on a rope, a dark bay gelding that moved with the same quiet steadiness as its owner. The man's hat was pulled low against the afternoon sun. He carried a bedroll across one shoulder. He had the build of someone who had spent years doing hard physical work. Not a large man, not imposing in the way that some frontier men tried to be, but compact and capable-looking in a way that was somehow more reassuring than imposing. Theodora watched him approach the gate that marked the entrance to her property and was about to turn away when he stopped at the gate and called out in a voice that reached her clearly across the field. "Afternoon, ma'am. Your gate hinge is cracked. Looks like it'll give within the week." She turned back. That was a specific, useful, accurate observation, not the sort of opening gambit a man deployed when he wanted to sell something or beg something. She walked toward the gate. Up close, he was younger than the wear of the road suggested. She put him at 28, perhaps 29. His face was tanned to the color of red clay, with laugh lines at the corners of dark brown eyes that currently held something careful and assessing in them. He was looking at her the way she had just been looking at the wheat, reading for information, not for weakness. "Matthew Chandler," he said, removing his hat. His dark hair was pushed flat by the band. "Have been working wheat harvest up through the northern counties. I have heard there are farms in Harlan County still looking for hands before the August heat sets in." "I am Theodora Atwood," she said. "I have one field hand all ready for the season, a boy from town, 16, good enough but not experienced. I cannot afford more than one additional wage." "What are you offering?" She told him the figure. It was honest and not generous because she had nothing beyond honest and not generous to offer. He considered it for a moment. He was not a man, she noticed, who felt any need to fill silence. "I will take it," he said, "on one condition." She raised an eyebrow. She had learned from 2 years of surviving alone in a world full of men who assumed that widowhood rendered a woman either helpless or grateful to a fault that a raised eyebrow was often more effective than any words. "The condition is that you do not ask me about where I have been," he said plainly. "I will work hard for you. I will not drink on your property. I will not cause trouble, and I will not leave before the harvest is finished. I ask that you give me the same decency of not interrogating my history." The request was direct, and she realized with some surprise, deeply familiar. She had her own parts of her past she preferred not to excavate in front of strangers. "Agreed," she said. "You can put your horse in the south paddock. The bunkhouse is behind the main barn." His name, she would learn in pieces over the following weeks, was Matthew James Chandler. He was 29 years old, born in Missouri, and had spent the better part of 7 years moving through the Western Territories, not running exactly, but not anchoring either. He was what they called a drifter, but the word had never suited him well because drifters implied passivity, a kind of surrender to circumstance, and Matthew Chandler was never passive about anything. He moved deliberately. He chose his direction. He simply had not yet found a direction that wanted to keep him. He was, she understood very quickly, extraordinarily competent. The first morning, he was up before sunrise. She came out at 5:30 to begin the day and found him already at the well, filling the stock troughs, having apparently assessed which animals needed water most and attended to them in order of priority. The dark bay gelding stood in the south paddock watching its owner with what Theodora could only describe as patient loyalty. By the end of the first week, she had raised his wages by 10%. She did not tell him why. She simply put the extra coin in the envelope on Friday evening and handed it to him, and he looked at it and then at her, and gave her a single nod that communicated understanding and gratitude, without any of the elaborate performance of either. Young Eli Graves, the 16-year-old she had hired from town, took to Matthew with the transparent admiration of a boy who had grown up without a father, and recognized in Matthew the kind of competence and quietness he associated with the men he wished he had known. Matthew treated Eli with a straightforward respect that gave the boy dignity without coddling him, and within a week, Eli was working harder than Theodora had ever seen him work. The shame of being outworked by a man twice his age, and the pride of being treated as an equal apparently combined to produce excellent results. What Theodora had not expected was the effect Matthew Chandler would have on her. She was 26 years old. She had been widowed for 2 years. She was not, she had believed, a woman who would easily be moved by a hired hand with dark eyes and a talent for mending things that were broken, and she was not wrong. It was not easy. It was slow and resistant and complicated and arrived in pieces, the way a real feeling always does, without announcing itself until it had already settled in and made itself at home. It started with small things. The way he listened when she spoke, not with the distracted patience of a man waiting for his turn to talk, but with genuine attention, the kind that made her feel, for the first time in a long time, that what she was saying was worth hearing. The way he asked questions about the farm, not the polite questions of a man making conversation, but the practical questions of someone who genuinely wanted to understand how the operation worked, what her plans were, what she was worrying about. The way he fixed the gate hinge on the second day without being asked, and the fence post, and the loose board on the barn floor that had been waiting for someone strong enough to care about it. He fixed things. That was the dangerous part. Not just the physical things, though those were considerable, but the way that having him present made the farm feel less like a burden she was enduring and more like a place with a future. In the evenings after supper, she sometimes found herself staying at the kitchen table longer than she needed to, listening to the sounds of him and Eli settling the animals for the night, and she felt something that frightened her precisely because it felt so much like the thing she had believed she had locked away when Preston died. It felt like anticipation. It felt like home. She told herself it was gratitude. She told herself it was the practical comfort of having competent help. She told herself, on the harder evenings when the feeling got sharper and more specific, that she was simply lonely and that any decent man would have produced the same effect. She did not entirely believe any of these things. The first real conversation happened in the 3rd week of July, on a Sunday afternoon when Eli had gone to town to visit his mother and Theodora had found herself on the porch with a glass of water and the unusual luxury of nothing urgent demanding her attention. Matthew had come around the side of the house with a piece of harness leather he had been mending and had stopped at the porch steps with a look that asked, without words, whether she minded company. She gestured at the other chair. He sat. He worked on the harness. She watched the heat shimmer over the fields. "You have been farming this land alone for 2 years," he said eventually. It was not a question. "Yes. The north quarter is newly plowed, but the seed is different from the east and south fields." "You are experimenting." She looked at him. He was still focused on the harness. "Hard winter wheat variety, new cultivar out of Kansas State Agricultural College. I received seed stock from them in the spring. I planted a test quarter to see how it performs against my established variety." "Smart," he said. "It may not work." "It may not," he agreed. "But you will know either way, and knowing is valuable." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Most people in this county would tell a woman farming alone to sell the land and find simpler work. Most people have a narrow imagination of what a woman can accomplish," he said, without any particular heat. Simply as a statement of observable fact. She looked at him more carefully then. He was still focused on the leather, his hands moving with the precise economy of someone who had done this repair dozens of times. "Where did you work before the northern counties?" she asked, and then remembered the condition of his employment. "I am sorry. You told me Nebraska," he said. "Before that, Wyoming. Before that, I spent 2 years in New Mexico Territory." He glanced up then, and there was something complicated in his eyes. "I am not hiding anything shameful, Mrs. Atwood. I simply find that a history explained too early gives people a version of you they settle into, before they have had a chance to see who you actually are. She absorbed this. It was a remarkably perceptive thing to say. It was also, she noticed, the kind of thing that a person said when they had been reduced to their history before and found it unjust. "That is sensible," she said. "You have a version of the same philosophy," he observed. "I watched you talking with the grain buyer from Harlan last week. You answered every question he asked and volunteered nothing extra." She smiled without meaning to. "Mr. Fletcher is a man who collects other people's circumstances and uses them to negotiate price. I noticed. You negotiated the delivery rate down by 4 cents a bushel." "I did." She had not thanked him for that yet. She did so now, and he received it with the same quiet nod as the raise, and they sat in comfortable silence for a while longer, and Theodora Atwood understood that she was in some degree of trouble. The harvest began in the second week of August, earlier than she had hoped, but the wheat was ready and the weather was holding, and she could not afford to wait. She brought in 2 additional temporary workers from town, older men, reliable, who had worked harvests before, and for 3 weeks the farm hummed with the specific and exhausting energy of harvest time. Matthew worked harder than anyone. Not in a way that called attention to itself, but in the steady, relentless way of a man who had decided that a job was worth doing completely. He was up before first light and still at it when the light failed, and on the evenings when he did stop early enough to eat supper at the farmhouse table with Theodora and Eli, he was quiet with the deep and pleasant tiredness of a man who had used himself well. Theodora found herself cooking better during this period. She noticed it with some amusement and some alarm. The biscuits were lighter, the stew was more carefully seasoned, the coffee was fresher. She was not doing it consciously. She was simply, apparently, cooking for someone whose opinion of the food mattered to her in a way that Preston's gentle indifference had never quite produced. Preston had eaten whatever she put in front of him with the same cheerful absent-mindedness with which he had approached most domestic matters, and she had loved him for many things, but his appreciation of cooking had not been among them. Matthew, by contrast, ate with attention. He noticed flavors. On the evening she had added dried wild herbs to the cornbread, an experiment she had been considering for months and had finally attempted. He had looked up from the bread with an expression of genuine pleasure and said, "That is something different. What is it?" And she had told him about the herbs, and he had asked her where she gathered them, and she had described the creek bed to the north of the property. And before she quite understood how it had happened, they were talking about the land and what grew on it, and what the changing of the seasons felt like out here on the plains. And the temporary workers had long since cleared away their plates, and it was just the 2 of them at the table and the lamp burning low between them. She did not sleep well that night. The harder thing, the thing she had been avoiding naming even inside the privacy of her own thoughts, was that she had begun to notice that Matthew Chandler sometimes looked at her the way a man looked at something he was trying very hard not to want too badly. She was not inexperienced in reading that kind of glance. Preston had looked at her that way in the early months of their courtship, with that particular combination of hope and restraint that was its own kind of declaration. She had known what it meant then, she knew what it meant now. And the knowing sent a complicated mix of warmth and terror through her, because she understood that whatever was building between them was not simple, was not temporary, and was not going to resolve cleanly when the harvest ended. The question of what Matthew would do when the harvest ended had been circling in her mind since the middle of August. He had said he would stay until the harvest was finished. He had said nothing beyond that. Most harvest hands moved on. There was always another county, another farm, another opportunity, and she had told herself that his leaving was the natural and expected conclusion of this arrangement, and that she should prepare for it as a practical matter and not as a loss. She was not succeeding at that preparation. At the end of August, she had a crisis that had nothing to do with the harvest and everything to do with the loan. She had ridden into Harlan to conduct some business at the general store, and had stopped at the bank to inquire about the terms of the November payment. specifically whether there was any flexibility on the date, given that the harvest would require time to properly market, and the grain buyer often took 2 to 3 weeks to finalize payment after delivery. Mr. Harlow had received her with his usual smile of measured sympathy and had told her, with what she recognized as rehearsed regret, that the bank's board had recently tightened the terms on agricultural loans in the county and that no extension of the November 1st date would be possible. There was more. Mr. Harlow had leaned forward and told her, in the tone of a man delivering unwelcome news out of pure benevolence, that a party had expressed interest in purchasing the farm should she find herself unable to meet the November payment. The party had made an offer to the bank in anticipation of potential foreclosure. It was a fair offer, Harlow said. She would receive the difference between the sale price and the outstanding debt, which would leave her enough to make a fresh start somewhere. The party's name was Clarence Dunn. She had kept her face still and her hands still and her voice still, and had thanked Mr. Harlow for the information and had walked out of the bank, and stood in the October heat of the main street of Harlan for a long moment before she trusted herself to move. Clarence Dunn was a rancher who owned the largest spread in the county, a man of 45 who had been steadily acquiring farmland along the creek drainage for 3 years, consolidating small homesteads into his cattle operation. He had made a verbal offer on her property 6 months after Preston died, when she was still raw and disoriented with grief, and the bank note had been new enough to feel abstract. She had declined. He had made another offer the following year, this one through an intermediary, with the suggestion delivered with the plausible deniability of a man who understood how to threaten, without appearing to, that a woman farming alone in Harlan County might find life considerably easier under different circumstances. She had declined that one too. Now Dunn had apparently decided that waiting for her to be reasonable was taking too long, and had arranged with the bank to be positioned to take the farm the moment she missed a payment. The trap was elegant in its cynicism. If the harvest proceeds arrived late, or if the grain buyer lowballed her, or if any unexpected expense consumed a portion of the funds she needed, she would fall short, and the farm would belong to Clarence Dunn before Christmas. She rode home in a controlled fury that took the entire 12 miles to settle into something she could think with. Matthew saw her face when she came through the gate. He was working on the equipment near the barn, and he looked up and watched her dismount, and did not say anything while she unsaddled her horse and brushed it down with the mechanical concentration of someone who needed a physical task to think through. He waited. He was very good at waiting. She finally told him, standing at the fence rail with her back to the house and the late afternoon sun in her eyes. When she finished, Matthew was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Do you know what the current fair market price for number 2 hard wheat is?" She told him. She had checked before the season started. "Your East field alone should produce enough at that price to cover the note, plus interest, with approximately $30 to $40 left over, depending on yield. The North Quarter experimental field is a potential additional income source if the cultivar performed. Have you weighed and measured the harvest inventory?" She had. She told him the numbers. He nodded slowly. "You can make the payment. If you get the price you deserve for the grain, the problem is not the harvest. The problem is the grain buyer." She looked at him. "Fletcher," he said. "He has been in a price negotiation with you all season. He knows you need to settle before November 1st. He will wait until the last possible moment and then offer you a price below market, counting on your need to force you to take it." "I know that," she said, and she did. She had known it. But hearing it laid out with such clarity by someone else felt like cold water on a hot stone. "I do not have another buyer. Fletcher has the only grain elevator within practical distance. There is a cooperative buyer out of Wichita who has been extending his territory into Harlan County. I heard about him while working the harvests to the north. He pays market price and does not play waiting games." Matthew paused. "I can ride to Wichita and make contact. I know how to negotiate grain contracts." That is a 4-day ride. 3 if I push. Matthew, the harvest is essentially finished, he said. The remaining work here is thrashing and sacking, which Eli can manage for a few days. I would be back before the week is out. She looked at him for a long moment. The low sun was catching the angles of his face, the strong line of his jaw, the steadiness in his eyes. There was no hidden motive visible there, no calculation of personal advantage in his offer, no leverage being positioned. He simply saw a problem and was offering to help solve it because that was, apparently, what he did. Why? She asked. He met her eyes without flinching. Because I have been watching you work this farm with everything you have for the past 2 months, and you deserve to keep it. The simplicity of it undid her more thoroughly than any complicated profession could have. She turned away quickly and looked at the fields, her fields, golden with the finished harvest, beautiful and stubborn and necessary, and breathed slowly until she could trust her expression. "All right," she said. "Go." He was back in 4 days, arriving on the afternoon of the 4th day looking like he had pushed the gelding past comfortable pace and was carrying a folded paper in his coat pocket. He handed it to her without ceremony. It was a contract offer from the Wichita Cooperative at 2 cents per bushel above Fletcher's last stated price, with a 10-day settlement window and no foreclosure clause advantages for any third party. It would cover the bank note. It would cover the interest. It would leave her, after the payment, with $62, enough to carry the farm through winter and into the next planting season without borrowing again. She read it twice. Then she read it a 3rd time. "This is real," she said. "It is real." She looked up at him. He was dusty and tired, and his eyes were soft with something she could not quite name, and she was standing on her porch with the paper in her hands and $62 of future in her chest, and she did something she had not done since the weeks immediately after Preston's death. She cried. Not dramatically, she was not a dramatic woman. Just a few hot, silent tears that she turned away to manage before they became something more conspicuous, pressing her hand briefly against her mouth and looking at the sky until the tightness passed. When she turned back, Matthew had not moved, and his expression carried a careful respect. He was not looking away out of discomfort, and he was not looking closer out of some misguided need to witness her vulnerability. He was simply present, and allowing her to be present too, and that restraint was the most tender thing she had ever seen a man do. "Thank you," she said when she could. He nodded. "We should sign the contract and get it sent back to Wichita." She laughed once, short and a little wet. "Yes, we should." They went inside and signed the contract at the kitchen table, and she fixed coffee, and there were the biscuits, the herb biscuits, because she had made them that morning on some instinct she refused to examine. And they sat at the table and talked for an hour about the logistics of the grain delivery and the timing of the final thrashing. And somewhere in the middle of that conversation, the crisis became simply a problem that was being solved, and the farm became simply a farm with a future again. And she felt, for the first time since this whole terrible spring, like she could breathe all the way down. September came in with cooler nights and the smell of change. The grain was delivered to the Wichita buyer's representative in the 1st week of September, and the payment cleared by the 3rd week. And on the 22nd of September, Theodora Atwood walked into the Harlan County Bank and placed $140 plus 18 months of accumulated interest on Mr. Harlow's desk, and watched his smile recalibrate into something closer to genuine surprise. The note was paid. The farm was free and clear. She walked out into the sunlight of the main street of Harlan feeling lighter than she had in years, and she thought of the man waiting back at the farm with the same instinct with which she had once thought of Preston after small victories and large ones, and she stopped on the sidewalk and made herself acknowledge what that meant. She was in love with Matthew Chandler. The acknowledgement did not arrive with any particular drama. It arrived with the quiet certainty of a thing that had been true for some time, and was simply now being given its name. She was in love with him. She had been falling in love with him since approximately the end of July, and she had been fighting it with every practical and self-protective instinct she possessed, and she had lost. The question was what to do about it. She rode home thinking about the hidden complications of what she felt. Matthew was a drifter, a man who had spent 7 years moving, a man who had made a contract with himself not to stay, a man whose past she did not fully know. She was a widow with a farm and roots that went 3 feet into the Kansas soil. Their lives were built for different things, and yet, he had stayed through the whole summer. He had ridden to Wichita. He had fixed every broken thing on her property and some things that had not been broken yet but would have been. He had sat with her on Sunday afternoons and talked about the farm and the land and the future with the investment of a man who had a stake in the outcome. She could not tell what he wanted, and she was afraid, not of him, not in the way the word was sometimes applied to women and men on the frontier, but afraid in the older, truer sense. Afraid of the vulnerability of wanting something this much. Afraid of the betrayal that came when something you had allowed yourself to need turned out to be temporary. She had lost Preston suddenly, without warning, without any preparation for the grief, and she had survived it by becoming a person who did not need things she could not guarantee keeping. Matthew Chandler was not a thing she could guarantee keeping. October brought the final work of the season, the mending and preparation that a farm required before winter, the putting up of stores, the securing of equipment, the small and necessary tasks that constituted the closing of the agricultural year. Eli Graves had gone back to town at the end of September with honest wages in his pocket, and a respect for work that he had not quite had at the beginning of the summer. The additional hands had gone their own ways at the end of harvest. Only Matthew remained. He had not said he was leaving. He had not said he was staying. He had simply continued to be present, working with the same steady purposefulness, occupying the bunkhouse with an ease that suggested he had not consciously decided to go. Theodora had not raised the subject. She had not been able to make herself raise the subject. The days grew shorter, and the light shifted to the particular clear gold of Kansas autumn, and the two of them moved through the work of the farm together in a rhythm that had become so natural. It was almost possible to forget that it had been built over only a few months. They talked more easily now, not just about practical matters, but about ideas, about the changing territory, about the injustice of the land policies that kept breaking small farmers while rewarding the large operations like Dunn's, about the books she had brought from Missouri when she married Preston, some of which she lent to Matthew, and which he returned with careful pencil marks in the margins at passages he had found interesting. She began to understand his past in pieces, the way he had allowed. He had grown up on a Missouri farm, the second son of a hard-working but unlucky man who had lost the land to a bad year and a worse banker when Matthew was 15. The family had dispersed. Matthew had gone west. He had worked everything: cattle drives, railroad grading, mine support, freight hauling, harvests in 6 different territories. He was not running from anything specific and shameful, as he had said. He was running from a version of himself he did not want to become, the version that stayed in one place long enough to lose it. "You are afraid of staying," she said one evening in early October, when they had been talking long enough that the boundary between thought and word had grown thin. He looked at her across the kitchen table. The lamp was between them. "Yes," he said, "because of your father's land. Because of a pattern I observed," he said carefully. "Men who put down deep roots in one place, the land becomes the person. The loss of the land becomes the loss of the self. My father never recovered from losing that farm. He was diminished by it. I did not want that vulnerability." She thought about this. She understood it with more clarity than she wished she did. "And yet you stayed here past the harvest," she said quietly. He was very still. "I stayed," he agreed. "Why?" The silence was long enough that she thought he would not answer. The lamp flame wavered in some breath of air from beneath the door, and the shadows shifted across his face. "Because something here is worth the vulnerability," he said at last, and looked at her with a directness that made her feel as though all the practical armor she had been assembling against this feeling was simply irrelevant. She did not know what to say. She had the words, she knew she had them, But the habit of self-protection was strong and the fear was real, and she said nothing. And the moment passed into the general silence of the evening, and they went to their separate beds. And the next morning they were both carefully, practically, professionally engaged with the work of the farm, and neither of them mentioned it. But she thought about it for 3 days without stopping. The thing she could not get past was the betrayal, not a betrayal that had happened, but a betrayal that felt inevitable. She had survived Preston's death by becoming essential to herself, by making sure that the farm and its demands were sufficient to constitute a life, by ensuring that she did not need anything she could not provide for herself. That survival had cost her something. She knew it had cost her. The loneliness was real, and sometimes in the long evenings it was like a pressure in the chest that she could not fully breathe through. But it was a known cost, a manageable one. What Matthew was offering was different. He was offering the removal of that cost at the price of a risk she could not calculate. He was a man with a dark past of impermanence. He was a man whose deepest instinct was to move. He had said he was afraid of staying. He had said something was worth the vulnerability, but he had not said he would stay, had not said he would remain, had not made any commitment beyond what was contained in the soft heat of that moment at the kitchen table. Was that enough? Was a man's willingness to acknowledge what he felt sufficient grounds to rebuild the kind of life that required another person? She did not know, and she was afraid of the not knowing. But on the 5th day after the kitchen table moment, she walked out of the farmhouse in the late afternoon and found Matthew mending the fence on the south pasture. Not because she had asked him to, not because it was part of any arrangement between them, but because it needed mending and he was there, and he was the kind of man who fixed things. And she felt something in her simply let go. Not the fear. The fear was still there. But the resistance, the deliberate, constructed, self-protective resistance, gave way like a gate latch releasing, and she understood that she had already made her decision. That she had made it sometime in August, or September, or possibly in late July on a Sunday afternoon when he had asked whether he could sit in the other chair on her porch. That the decision had been made, and she had simply been delaying its acknowledgement in the false belief that delay was the same as protection. She walked to the fence and stood beside him and said nothing for a moment, just watched him work, the way he had watched her manage her animals without offering unsolicited advice. Then she said, "I paid the note on the farm last week." "I know," he said, "you told me. It is mine free and clear. The land is mine, no debt." He kept working. "That is a very good thing." "I have been thinking," she said, "about what you said at the kitchen table." He stopped working then. He straightened and turned to look at her, and his eyes were very careful, very still, the way they got when something mattered. "I have been thinking about it for 5 days," she continued. "I have been trying to decide whether I am more afraid of what it means if you stay or what it means if you leave. And both frighten me equally," she said honestly. "But I think the fear of your leaving has recently surpassed the fear of your staying." Something happened in his expression that she could only describe as a warmth, the specific warmth of something held carefully for a long time finally being set down in a safe place. "Theodora," he said, "I am not asking you to promise me anything," she said, before he could continue, because it was important to her that this not be built on promises that outpaced understanding. "I am saying that I would like you to stay. That I would like to understand what this is, what we might be to each other, without either of us pretending that the other one is a practical arrangement." He reached out and took her hand from where it rested on the fence rail. His hand was calloused and warm and entirely steady, and he held hers in the way you held something you intended to keep hold of. "I am not going anywhere," he said. "You said you were afraid of staying." "I am," he said. "I am afraid of it right now. I am going to stay anyway." She looked at their joined hands for a moment. Then she looked up at his face, and what was there was unmistakable. The full, clean, unguarded expression of a man who had been tender with his feelings for a very long time and had finally found somewhere to put them. She felt the answering thing rise in her own chest, warm and certain and a little terrifying, and she did not fight it. "All right," she said softly. He brought her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, the old formal gesture, the courtly one, the one that meant "I see you and I honor you," and she felt it move through her like a slow river. They stood at the fence in the October light for a while longer, not saying much, not needing to. The horses moved in the south paddock. The wheat stubble in the fields caught the afternoon sun and turned it back to gold. The barn stood solid and mended and necessary on the edge of the horizon, and the farmhouse beyond it, with its kitchen and its lamp and its table where two people had sat across from each other all summer, slowly, carefully, inevitably falling in love. This was what she brought back to the present as she stood in the doorway of the farmhouse with Matthew at the fence post, and the last light going amber around them and the words hanging in the cold air between them. "Tell me to leave and watch me stay anyway." He had said it as a declaration, as a dare, as the most honest possible articulation of where they both were, that her fear might still, in some frightened corner of her heart, try to push him out, and that he was not going to let the fear win. That he had made his choice, and the choice was her, and the farm in Kansas and the future that was contained in the space between them, and nothing she said in a moment of panic was going to undo what they had built. She stepped off the porch. She crossed the yard in the cooling air of the October evening, through the smell of turned earth and dry grass and coming winter, and she stopped in front of him, and she looked up at his face in the last light of the day, and she said, "I do not want you to leave." Something in him went still in the way that deep relief looks from the outside, a quieting, a settling, like a tree that has been straining against wind, suddenly finding still air. "Good," he said. His voice was very rough, "because I was not going to." She put her hand flat against his chest, over his heart, and felt it beating strong and fast, faster than his stillness had suggested, and she said, "Matthew, I love you." He closed his eyes for one moment. Then he opened them, and they were so warm and so certain and so full of everything he had been carrying since July that she felt her own eyes fill. "I have been in love with you since approximately the second week of July," he said. "I want you to know that I tried very hard not to be." She laughed, wet and warm. "So did I. We were not very successful." "No, we were not." He brought both his hands up and framed her face, tipped it toward his, and kissed her with the full and tender weight of everything they had been to each other through this long, complicated, necessary summer, with the harvest and the loan and the threat of Clarence Dunn and the Sunday afternoons and the kitchen table and the herb biscuits and the Wichita contract and the mended fence posts and all the dozens of quiet moments that had built something real between two people who had both been very afraid of the very thing they were now choosing. It was the best kiss she had ever had in her life. She told him so, and he laughed into her hair, and the laugh was the most unguarded sound she had ever heard him make, free and low and warm, and she decided right there that she intended to make him laugh like that as many times as possible for the rest of her life. November came. Winter came. Matthew did not leave. He wrote to the Wichita Cooperative and arranged for the farm, now listed as Atwood Chandler Operation, to be included on the spring grain contract list for the following year. He was, she discovered, more financially resourceful than his drifter years had suggested. He had savings, not a great deal but not nothing, accumulated from 7 years of itinerant labor and a natural frugality, and he put them toward a pair of good draft horses that would expand their planting capacity for the spring. He proposed marriage on a cold December evening, with the first serious snow of the season falling outside the farmhouse windows. He did it quietly, at the kitchen table, their table, the one that had been the site of so many of the turning points of this story, with a plain gold ring that he said had been his grandmother's, which he had been carrying in his coat pocket since he left Missouri. "You have been carrying that ring for 7 years," she said. 9, he corrected, with the small self-aware smile that she had come to love particularly. "I took it before the family dispersed. I do not know what I thought. I thought that someday I might know what to do with it." She looked at the ring in his palm, then she looked at him. Then she said yes, and he put the ring on her finger with the same care he applied to everything, unhurried, precise, certain. And outside the snow fell on the fields, and the barn and the south paddock where the dark bay gelding stood with his head lowered against the cold, and inside the farmhouse was warm and lit and full. They were married in February of 1884, in the parlor of the Methodist Church in Harlan, with Eli Graves standing up for Matthew and Theodora's neighbor, and friend Clara Hobbs standing up for Theodora. It was a small wedding. They were both people who preferred things to be real rather than elaborate. But Clara had made sure there were flowers, dried wildflowers from the previous summer, in simple arrangements that made the parlor smell like the prairie in August. Theodora wore a dress she had made herself from wool fabric in a dark blue that Matthew had told her, 1 week before the wedding, and with characteristic directness, was the color that suited her best. She had pretended to be amused by the unsolicited opinion while privately being charmed by it. She wore her hair up in a style that was simple and neat, and that she had been practicing for 2 weeks. She carried a small bundle of the dried wildflowers. Matthew wore his best coat and a waistcoat he had purchased in Harlan specifically for the occasion, and he looked at her when she came down the aisle of the small church with an expression that she would remember for the rest of her life, open and certain and full of wonder, the expression of a man for whom the arrival of the thing he had feared wanting most was still, after months of knowing it was coming, somehow more than he had let himself believe. The minister performed the ceremony with a warmth and brevity that suited both of them perfectly, and when Matthew said his vows, he said them looking at her with the same full attention he had given everything she had ever said to him, and she said hers back with the same clarity and conviction that she applied to everything she decided to do. And when the minister pronounced them married, the small congregation, mostly neighbors and the few friends Theodora had cultivated in 2 years of solitary farming, applauded with a warmth that suggested they had all been watching this particular development with approval. Clara hosted a small wedding supper at her house afterward, and Matthew sat beside Theodora at the table with the ease of a man who had always belonged in that particular position. And Eli Graves made a toast that was heartfelt and somewhat rambling, and ended with the declaration that Matthew was the best boss he had ever worked for, and that he hoped the Chandler farm would need extra hands come harvest, and everyone laughed. And Matthew caught Theodora's eye across the table, and the look between them was the kind that belongs only to 2 people who have shared the specific history. They had shared the full knowledge of how close this had come to not happening, and the full gratitude that it had. Spring came and the planting began, and the farm expanded in exactly the ways Matthew had been quietly planning through the winter months. The new draft horses, a pair of heavy-boned chestnut mares that Theodora named Charlotte and Frances, proved their worth in the first week of plowing, covering ground that would have taken twice as long with the single older horse she had been using. Matthew was up before dawn every day and working long past dusk, but this was different from the first summer, different because it was his own work now, his land as much as hers, his future as much as hers, and the energy he brought to it was not the focused competence of a hired hand, but the deep and full investment of a man who has finally found the thing worth building. He was also, she discovered, a man with a talent for the business side of farming that complemented her own practical and experimental instincts. She was the one who tried new varieties, who read the agricultural college bulletins, who wanted to know what was happening in the science of farming. He was the one who tracked market prices, who built relationships with buyers and suppliers, who could look at a season's numbers and tell her what they meant for the next season's decisions. Together, they were considerably more capable than either had been separately, and the farm showed it. By summer of 1884, the North Quarter experimental wheat, the hard winter variety she had planted the previous year, had performed so well that she doubled the planting area for it. The Wichita Cooperative was so pleased with the quality of the Atwood Chandler grain that they offered a preferred rate for the following year's contract. Matthew negotiated the terms and came home from the meeting with a satisfaction that manifested as quiet good humor and the willingness to sit on the porch for an entire Sunday afternoon, doing nothing more productive than watching the cloud shadows move across the fields, which was his particular form of celebration. She sat beside him and watched the clouds and thought about the distance between this moment and the July afternoon when he had first appeared at her gate, and felt the full, warm weight of what a year could contain. Clarence Dunn was not finished, as it turned out. In the autumn of 1884, word came through the county that Dunn had been employing a practice that several small farmers had experienced. He had been buying up delinquent water rights along the creek drainage that fed the eastern portions of several farms, including a stretch of creek that ran along the northern edge of the Chandler property. The water rights in Kansas were still something of a legal tangle in 1884, and Dunn had been working with a lawyer out of Topeka to exploit the ambiguity. Matthew heard about it from a neighboring farmer named Henderson, who had already lost a water dispute to Dunn and was advising everyone in the county to check their title paperwork. Matthew checked their title paperwork. The creek rights were included in the original homestead filing that Theodora had received when Preston first claimed the land, but the documentation was imprecise in the way that frontier land filings often were, and Dunn's lawyer had apparently identified the imprecision as an exploitable gap. "He is not going to take our water," Matthew said, sitting at the kitchen table with the land documents spread out before him. His voice was perfectly level, which Theodora had learned meant he was working through something very carefully. "What can we do?" The Agricultural Association in Topeka has a land rights advocate, a man named Gideon Park, who has been working against exactly this kind of consolidation scheme for 2 years. I have his name from the cooperative contact. I will write to him. "That could take months." "It probably will," he agreed. "In the meantime, I want to document every use of that creek water, when we draw from it, what we use it for, how it affects the farm." A pattern of established use is a legal argument in itself. She looked at him across the table. The lamp was between them, as it so often was in the moments that mattered most. "You know about land law." "I know about what happened when someone did not protect their rights," he said, and she heard in that the old story, his father's land, the lesson that had driven him west at 15. "I paid attention to what I should have done differently." The correspondence with Gideon Park took 3 months, as predicted, but the result was decisive. Park had encountered Dunn's methods before and had a legal brief already prepared that addressed the specific ambiguity in the creek rights filings across the county. By January of 1885, the Chandler Farm's water rights were formally documented and legally bulletproof, and Dunn's attempt to acquire the creek access was permanently blocked. 3 other farms in the county benefited from the same legal action. Matthew and Theodora hosted a small gathering at the farm when the news came through, a practical, celebratory supper for the neighbors who had also been protected. And it was the first time that the farmhouse had been full of people in a way that felt like community rather than just hired help. And Theodora stood in the kitchen watching Matthew talking with Henderson and the other farmers, and felt a happiness so complete and uncomplicated that it almost surprised her with its simplicity. In the spring of 1885, Theodora discovered she was expecting a child. She told Matthew on a March morning when the snow was still on the ground, but the first hint of the coming season was already in the quality of the light, that particular brightening that happens in March on the Kansas plains when the sun begins to mean what it says again. She told him plainly and directly, because that was how she told things, and watched his face go through several things in quick succession: surprise, and then something that was almost disbelief, and then a joy so large and honest that it transformed his whole expression into something she had never seen there before. He crossed the kitchen in 2 strides and held her, and she felt his arms around her with the same solid warmth she had felt since the first time. And he said her name into her hair twice, and that was the extent of the declaration, but it was entirely sufficient. "Are you frightened?" he asked when he had let himself believe it. "Somewhat," she said. "Are you?" "Very much," he said. "In a good way. Is there a good way to be frightened?" "I believe so, yes." The pregnancy was uncomplicated, which she attributed partly to her own physical constitution. She had always been strong, physically resilient in the way that 2 years of hard farm work had made her, and partly to the fact that she was not managing the farm alone. Having Matthew there, through the summer when the work was hardest and the heat was worst, and she was slower and more tired than she was accustomed to being, was the difference between managing and flourishing. He absorbed the work she could not do without being asked, and he did it with the same matter-of-fact competence he applied to everything. And on the days when she was tired and uncomfortable, he had a talent for finding small ways to make things easier that she found deeply and specifically moving. Eli Graves came back for the harvest of 1885, taller and more confident than before, and brought 2 friends from town who wanted harvest work. Matthew ran the operation with the same quiet authority he had always carried, and the harvest that year was the best the farm had produced, better than 1883, better than the year before, a harvest that exceeded projections and produced a surplus that went into savings. The child was born in November, exactly as the first frost was settling on the Kansas plains. It was a boy. Matthew held his son with the same careful precision with which he did everything. Standing in the bedroom of the farmhouse on a cold November night with the lamp burning and Theodora watching from the bed, exhausted and warm and entire. The baby was red and small and furiously alive, making his displeasure with the world known at considerable volume, and Matthew looked at him with an expression that combined absolute terror with absolute love in approximately equal measure, and Theodora laughed softly at the sight. "He looks angry," Matthew said. "He has reason to be. He has just arrived in the world. Give him a moment to adjust." As if in response, the baby stopped crying and looked up, not at anything in particular, with the unfocused gaze of the newly born, and Matthew looked back, and something happened between them in that moment that Theodora would think about for years afterward. Some recognition. Some transaction of belonging. They named him James for Matthew's father, whose land had been lost but whose memory deserved something better than only grief. James Chandler grew into the farm the way children do when the land is in their early memory, with the absolute unself-conscious belonging of someone who has never known anything else to compare it to. He was, by the time he was old enough to form preferences, clearly his mother's son in temperament, curious and precise, and not easily impressed, and his father's son in practical ability, with an early and intuitive grasp of how things worked mechanically and structurally that gave Matthew a satisfaction so deep he was sometimes reduced to simply watching the boy with a quiet wonder. They built an addition to the farmhouse in the winter of 1886, a second bedroom and a proper pantry, work that Matthew and Henderson and 2 men from town accomplished over a series of cold December weekends, with Theodora providing the organizational intelligence and the food and the specific, practiced attention of a woman who knew exactly what she wanted in a house and was not shy about communicating it. When the addition was finished, Theodora stood in the new bedroom with the smell of fresh-cut pine all around her and Matthew at her shoulder and felt, with a clarity she had not experienced since the moment she had stood in front of Mr. Harlow's desk and settled the note that her life was exactly what she had made it. That every choice, the choice to stay after Preston died, the choice to fight for the farm, the choice to hire a drifter with dark eyes and a talent for mending broken things, the choice to open the locked door of her heart, had led here to this room, to this man, to this life. She turned and looked at him. He was leaning in the doorframe, watching her think. He still did that, watched her think, with the same patient attention he had always given her. "Well," he said, "It is exactly right," she said. He smiled, and it was the full smile, the unguarded one she had first heard in his laugh on the October evening after she had told him she loved him. It still had the same effect on her that it always had, which was to make her feel simultaneously as though she had been given something irreplaceable and as though she had come home. In 1887, 2 years after James, their second child arrived. Another boy, whom they named Edwin, and who turned out to be his father's son in temperament, quiet and deliberate, and given to long silences that contained more than they revealed, and his mother's son in ability, specifically in the garden and the kitchen, which he took to with an early and unabashed pleasure that neither of his parents saw any reason to redirect. Theodora wrote to her sister in Missouri, the sister she had been out of regular contact with in the years of solitary farming, the contact allowed to lapse under the weight of managing everything alone, and re-establish the correspondence. And in the summer of 1887, her sister, Ellen, came to visit with her own husband and their 2 children, and the farmhouse was briefly and gloriously full in a way that the walls seemed to expand to accommodate. And Matthew sat on the porch in the evenings with Ellen's husband, a man named Thomas who turned out to share Matthew's background of Missouri farming and frontier work, and Theodora watched them talking and felt the mending of something old. She wrote to the Agricultural College in Manhattan, Kansas, about the hard winter wheat results they had achieved over 4 seasons with the new cultivar, and submitted her growing notes and yield data. The college published a summary of her findings in their annual agricultural report. She received a letter from the college's head of agronomy calling her documentation exemplary and asking whether she would be willing to participate in a broader study of frontier wheat varieties. She showed Matthew the letter over breakfast. He read it twice, then looked up and said simply, "Of course you will. It would mean correspondence work, extra time." "It would mean that what you have learned here is useful to other farmers," he said. "Yes, of course you will," she did. The correspondence with the Agricultural College became one of the more unexpected satisfactions of her life. The discovery that the practical knowledge she had been accumulating through years of trial and error and careful observation had genuine scientific value, that she was not just a farmer but a contributor to the collective understanding of how to farm this difficult and beautiful land. Matthew was unsurprised by any of this. He had always known what she was capable of. He had simply been waiting for the rest of the world to catch up. In 1888, Harlan County held its first organized county fair. Matthew was on the planning committee. His combination of organizational competence and genuine interest in agricultural development had made him a natural figure in county affairs in a way that would have surprised anyone who had known him as a drifter. And Theodora entered 3 categories: best wheat yield per acre, best preserved goods, and a baking category that she entered primarily to satisfy Clara Hobbs, who had been lobbying for it. She won all 3. Matthew's reaction to this was to find her immediately after the judging and take her by both hands and look at her with an expression of satisfaction so complete that several people standing nearby smiled in response to it without quite knowing why. "I told you," he said. "You told me nothing," she said, laughing. "I told you everything. You simply did not need me to say it out loud." That was true. She had not, in a long time, needed him to say it out loud. It was present in the way he moved through their shared life, in the steadiness and the attention and the daily choosing of her and the farm and the boys and the future. It was present in the way he still sat in the second chair on the porch on Sunday afternoons, not because she had offered it once but because it was where he belonged. It was present in the mended things, the gate hinge, the fence posts, the water rights, the connection to her sister, the small and ongoing repairs of a life being actively maintained. Clarence Dunn, in the end, overreached catastrophically. His pattern of acquiring delinquent water rights and pressuring small farmers continued through 1886 and 1887, but the legal framework that Gideon Park had established was increasingly being used against him, and by 1888 two of the farmers he had most aggressively targeted had brought successful legal actions. Dunn's reputation, which had always been built partly on the assumption that small farmers lacked the resources and the unity to fight back effectively, crumbled under the evidence that they did. He sold a significant portion of his eastern holdings in 1889 and ceased operating in Harlan County entirely by 1890. The farmland he sold was bought by the families of two of the farmers he had tried to displace, and Theodora allowed herself a particular satisfaction at that. Matthew turned 35 in the fall of 1889, and Theodora organized a small celebration, a supper with Clara and her husband, and Henderson and his wife, and Eli Graves, who had by then become a fixture of the farm's seasonal labor, and something closer to a family friend. And afterward, sitting on the porch in the cool autumn air with the lamp throwing warm light through the window behind them, Matthew said something that she had been waiting without knowing she was waiting for it. "I spent 9 years afraid of this," he said. She looked at him. "Of what specifically?" He gestured, a small, contained gesture that somehow encompassed the farm and the house and the light in the window and the sound of James and Edwin sleeping inside, all of it. "Of this," he said, "of having something to lose." She was quiet for a moment, and she said, "And I think the fear was always telling me the wrong thing," he said. "It told me that having something to lose was the danger. But what it did not tell me was that the loss of the thing I was afraid of losing was much less terrible than the alternative." He paused. "The alternative was never having it." She took his hand on the porch rail, and they sat together in the autumn dark, and the farm was around them, and the stars were overhead, and the boys were sleeping, and the harvest was in, and the debt was paid, and the water was secured, and the future was, for the first time in both their lives, something they could see all the way to the horizon. "You were worth the staying," she said. He turned his head and looked at her, and his eyes were warm and certain and full of everything they had built together, all the seasons of it. "So were you," he said. "So was all of this." The years that followed continued to build on what they had made. James, at 5, developed his father's habit of appearing silently wherever work was being done, and inserting himself into it with the calm assumption that his help was needed, which it often was. Edwin, at 3, had begun to follow Theodora through the kitchen garden with a focused attention that was purely his own, identifying plants by leaf shape and inquiring about their uses with a precision that occasionally outpaced her answers. In the summer of 1890, Theodora and Matthew rode together to a meeting of the Kansas Farmers Alliance in Harlan, one of the early meetings of what was becoming a significant political movement in the territory, addressing the injustices that had been squeezing small farmers for decades. The price fixing by grain elevator operators, the usurious railroad freight rates, the bank foreclosure practices that had made men like Dunn possible, these were real and systematic wrongs, and the Alliance was building the political infrastructure to address them. Matthew was, as always, direct and practical in his contributions, focused on the actionable and the achievable. Theodora was asked to present her yield data and her experiences with the cooperative grain buyer as evidence that alternatives to exploitative local monopolies were viable. She stood in the hall full of farmers and their wives and spoke clearly and without performance, and was, according to Clara, who had been watching the room rather than the speaker, the most persuasive voice of the afternoon. Theodora was unsurprised. She had been making arguments from evidence for years. She was simply doing it with a larger audience. Eli Graves married a young woman from Harlan in the fall of 1890 and brought her to the farm to meet the Chandlers with the particular mixture of pride and nervous hope that belongs to young men introducing their wives to people they love and respect. Her name was Alice, and she was direct and clear-eyed and practical in exactly the way that Theodora recognized as the trait she had most appreciated in Matthew, and she told Eli privately that he had done well. Eli turned a deep red, and thanked her in a way that suggested he had been hoping to hear exactly that. Christmas of 1890 was the fullest the farmhouse had ever been. Ellen and Thomas came again from Missouri, this time with 3 children, and Clara and her husband, and Eli and Alice, and Henderson and his wife brought a pie and stayed for supper, and the kitchen table had to be extended with a board and 2 extra chairs, and the noise level exceeded anything the house had previously experienced. And Matthew stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the main room at one point, and watched all of it with an expression that Theodora, passing him with a bowl of potatoes, recognized from the last time she had seen it on his face. It was the expression from the church in February of 1884. Open and certain and full of wonder, the expression of a man for whom the arrival of the thing he had feared wanting most was still, after years of knowing it, somehow more than he had allowed himself to expect. She stopped beside him and touched his arm. "More than you planned for," she said, quiet under the noise. He looked down at her. "Everything is more than I planned for." She thought about a man who had appeared at her gate in July of 1883 with nothing but a bedroll and a dark bay gelding, and a habit of fixing broken things, and a heart he had kept very carefully protected for 9 years. And she thought about what had been required to open that heart. The summer and the harvest and the crisis of the note, and the Wichita contract, and the kitchen table and the October evening and the ring and the years that followed. And she felt the full, warm, abundant weight of all of it. "So is mine," she said. He put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him. And through the doorway the table was full, and the lamp was burning, and James was explaining something to his Missouri cousins with gestures that were entirely his mother's. And Edwin was sitting quietly in the corner watching the fire with his father's particular brand of attentive stillness. And the farmhouse was full of the specific irreplaceable noise of a life that had been built on purpose. The dark past that Matthew had carried, the lost farm, the scattered family, the years of deliberate rootlessness, had not disappeared. It had not been erased by the love of a woman or the ownership of land or the birth of sons. But it had been transformed. The wound that had taught him that loving a place meant risking the loss of yourself had eventually, in the careful labor of this particular life with this particular woman, become the understanding that love did not create vulnerability, it created meaning. And meaning was not the same as risk. Meaning was the answer to risk. Theodora's own dark past, the grief of Preston, the years of solitary fighting, the wall she had built around her heart with such effective and exhausting industry, had also been transformed. Not removed, but integrated. Preston was not erased from her history. He was part of what she had been before Matthew, and part of what she had survived to become the woman who could stand at a fence rail in October and choose, against all her careful self-protection, to be open. She was grateful for both their histories. They had made them who they were when they needed to be who they were. The farm continued to grow and produce and improve. The experimental wheat became their primary variety, consistently outperforming the established cultivar, and the acreage expanded to cover the original North Quarter and 2 additional sections they purchased from a farmer who retired to live with family in 1891. Matthew handled the purchase with the financial precision of a man who had watched bad land deals destroy a family and had spent years learning how they worked and how to avoid them. The land was bought fair and clean, at a price both parties agreed was just. James turned 6 in November of 1891 and began attending the county school in Harlan, riding in with Henderson's children on the morning wagon, carrying a slate and a lunch pail and the perfectly matter-of-fact confidence of a boy who had been raised to believe that learning was simply what you did with your curiosity. Edwin turned 4, and Theodora began teaching him the same way she taught everything, through practice and observation, patient and precise. In the spring of 1892, Theodora discovered she was expecting again. She told Matthew at the kitchen table, with the lamp between them, in the same kitchen where so much had happened and been decided and understood over the years. His face went through the same sequence it had gone through the first time: surprise, disbelief, joy, and she laughed at his predictability. And he pulled her out of her chair and held her with a warmth that was both entirely familiar and somehow, after 9 years, still surprising in its depth. "A third," he said. "A third," she agreed. "I confess I am hoping for a daughter." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "So am I." She arrived in November of 1892, in the same cold and golden month as James, which Theodora took as a kind of symmetry the world had decided to provide. They named her Margaret, after Theodora's mother, who had died when Theodora was 19, and whose practical intelligence and refusal to be diminished by circumstance had been the model against which Theodora had measured herself through every hard year. Matthew held Margaret with the same expression he had held James 8 years before, the terror and the love in approximately equal measure, but with an additional quality that Theodora noticed and could not quite name until she understood it. It was recognition. He saw something in his daughter's face that he recognized, and she realized, watching him, that it was her. That Margaret had Theodora's eyes, the precise, assessing, intelligent eyes that had looked at him across a gate in July of 1883 and decided to hire a man with dark eyes and a habit of fixing things. "She looks like you," he said. "She has your nose," Theodora said. "She has your eyes. She is going to see right through every person she meets." "Good," Theodora said. "Let her." He smiled at her over the baby's head, and it was the full smile, the unguarded one, and it was still the most honest and beautiful thing she had ever seen on a human face, and she thought, this is the answer to the question that October evening asked, the question of whether a man's willingness to stay was sufficient grounds to rebuild a life. The answer was yes. The answer was 9 years of yes, accumulating in kitchens and fields and courtrooms and county fairs and Christmas suppers and births and seasons, all of it, each piece a stone in a foundation that held. The drifter had stayed. He had stayed through the harvest, and he had stayed through the winter and the spring and the years that followed, and every day he had stayed was its own quiet answer to the dare he had issued on that October evening at the fence post, with the last light going amber and the words hanging in the cold air between them. "Tell me to leave and watch me stay anyway." She had not told him to leave. But even in the moments when her fear had nearly spoken those words, and there had been such moments, in the early weeks when the feeling was new and terrifying, when the habit of self-protection had been strongest, she understood now that he had meant exactly what he said. That his decision had not been contingent on her being fearless. That he had chosen to stay not because she had made it easy, but because he had decided that the thing between them was worth choosing at the cost of everything he had spent 9 years protecting himself from. That was what tenderness looked like in its truest form. Not the absence of fear, but the choice made anyway. Not the guarantee of safety, but the willingness to be present without one. In later years, when the children were old enough to ask how their parents had met, James and Edwin and Margaret received the same answer in different forms, depending on their age and the moment. The full version, the one that Theodora and Matthew reserved for winter evenings when all 3 children were old enough to sit still and hear a real story, went something like this. In the summer of 1883, a man appeared at the gate of a farm in Harlan County, Kansas, and told the woman who came to meet him that her gate hinge was cracked. He was a man who had been moving for 9 years, afraid of the cost of staying in one place. She was a woman who had been holding a farm together alone for 2 years, afraid of the cost of needing anyone. They were afraid in complementary ways, which turned out to be either the best or the worst possible foundation for a love story, depending on how they handled it. They handled it by working alongside each other through a summer and a harvest and a crisis and a resolution and a slow, careful, persistent accumulation of honest moments until the fear was not gone but was no longer in charge. And then one October evening at a fence post, He had said, "Tell me to leave and watch me stay anyway." And she had not told him to leave, and he had stayed. That was the story. It was not particularly dramatic, by the standards of the territory they had lived in, which had seen its share of gunfights and betrayals and forced choices and men who rode into situations with hidden motives and dark pasts and ultimatums. But it was theirs, and it was true, and every year that passed, and every season that the farm produced, and every child that grew, and every morning that Matthew was present, and every evening that Theodora was across the table from him. Every piece of it was a continuation of the same story that had begun at a gate in July of 1883. The story of two people who had been afraid of the exact same thing for different reasons, and had chosen each other anyway. Margaret grew up knowing it. James grew up knowing it. Edwin grew up knowing it. It was part of the air of the farmhouse, the same way the smell of bread and the sound of the horses and the quality of light in October were part of it, something present and constant that you did not always notice because you had never known a world without it. The farm stood at the turn of the new decade, solid and well-tended and alive, the wheat fields extending to the horizon in the late summer light, the farmhouse with its two-room addition and its full kitchen and its porch with two chairs and the dark bay geldings descendant in the south paddock. The original horse had lived to a good age and been replaced by a son out of the same blood, dark and steady and loyal, the way good horses are when they come from good stock. Matthew Chandler was 35 when he stayed through the harvest and said, "Tell me to leave and watch me stay anyway." He was a man who had spent 9 years deciding whether the world contained anything worth the risk of putting down roots. He had found his answer at a gate in July, in the eyes of a woman who was reading trouble before it announced itself, and he had been working toward that answer ever since. Theodora Chandler, formerly Atwood, was 26 when she looked at a man on the road outside her farm and decided on the basis of one accurate observation about a gate hinge that he might be worth the wages. She had not known then what she was deciding. She had found out slowly and completely, and without the possibility of undeciding, and she had found that the thing she had been most afraid of was also the thing most worth wanting. They were 53 and 50 years old, respectively, in 1907, when James took over the management of the farm's day-to-day operations with the capable and attentive ease of a man for whom the work was second nature. Edwin had gone to the agricultural college in Manhattan, the same institution whose bulletins his mother had been reading for 20 years, and was on his way to becoming one of the foremost experts in Kansas on hard winter wheat cultivation, which felt like a satisfying continuation of something. Margaret had married a schoolteacher from Wichita and was raising 3 children and running the Sunday school with a combination of efficiency and warmth that would have been recognizable to anyone who had known her parents. Theodora and Matthew sat on the porch of the farmhouse in the October light of 1907, the same porch, the same 2 chairs, the same quality of amber light that fell across the Kansas plains in October, as though the world was trying to say something about the particular beauty of things that have lasted. She was reading. He was not doing anything in particular, just sitting, watching the fields in the way he had watched them for 24 years, with the satisfied attentiveness of a man who had made peace with staying and found it to be exactly the right decision. "Matthew," she said, without looking up from her book, I am glad I did not tell you to leave." He was quiet for a moment. She could feel him smiling without looking at him, the way you can feel certain things about a person after decades of knowing them. "So am I," he said. She turned a page. The light was warm and the fields were golden and the farm was everything it had been made to be, and in the south paddock the dark gelding moved through the late afternoon with the steady, unhurried pace of an animal that was exactly where it belonged. Theodora Chandler turned another page and breathed the October air, and felt the full and quiet abundance of a life that had been built on purpose, by 2 people who had been afraid and had chosen each other anyway. And she thought it was, all of it, The fear and the choosing and the years and the harvest and the children and the mended things and the unguarded smiles and the kitchen table and the October evenings and all the rest. It was all of it exactly right.